So let's do an activity. We have some options here. We want to pick the one that is more persuasive. Let's look at number 1. A, recycling can be good for the environment because it prevents plastic from being in the ocean. B, recycling benefits marine ecosystems by preventing plastic from being discarded into the ocean. Go ahead, take a second, look over this, pause if you need to, and once you think you know which one's more persuasive, unpause, and I'll tell you if you're right or if you're wrong. Okay. Which one is more persuasive? B. B is more persuasive. Why? Well, can be good versus benefits, right? Benefits is more specific than good, and it's also stronger than can be, right? Can be good implies that, oh, well, there are also situations where it might not be good, right? So benefits is better than can be good for 2 reasons. Marine ecosystems is more specific than the environment, right? Marine ecosystems is telling us specifically which aspect of the environment that we're talking about. And then we have prevents plastic from being in the ocean versus being discarded into the ocean. Being discarded into the ocean is better than being in the ocean, right? Because it's telling us more specifically about how it's getting into the ocean. So for those 3 reasons, B is better than A. Let's look at 2 now. A, the universe is big, which is why there is probably life on other planets. Versus, when considering how massive the universe is and how little of it astronomers have been able to analyze, it is practically inevitable that somewhere out there is another planet that hosts living beings. Go ahead, take a couple minutes, as much time as you need, give this a pause. When you're ready, unpause, and we'll go over it. Okay, so the more persuasive option here, again, is B. Big versus massive. Massive is better than big, right? Then we have probably versus practically inevitable, right? Probably means, well, it may or may not be the case. It seems likely, but really we don't know for sure. Versus practically inevitable saying it's pretty much a guarantee, right? It's stronger, way stronger than probably. Way more convincing than probably. And then the syntax is better on B than it is an A, right? A says the universe is big, which is why there is probably life on other planets. B says, when considering how massive the universe is and how little of it astronomers have been able to analyze, it is practically inevitable that somewhere out there is another planet that hosts living beings. They are kind of structured in a similar way. The difference here is that A doesn't give enough to set up this idea about life being on other planets, right? If we wanted to go with A, saying there's probably life on other planets because the universe is so big would be better. However, it's better, the syntax is better in B because we start off by saying that the universe is so massive and so little of it has been able to be analyzed, right? And because of that, it's practically inevitable. So B has syntax that works, A has syntax that doesn't work that well. In addition to these 2 diction changes. I was about to ask if anyone had any questions, but then I realized I'm just talking to my screen as of right now. Okay, let's do another activity. So we've talked about which of these options are better. Now I want you to fix the sentence yourself. No options. You have to make the changes on your own. So let's look at number 1. The New York Yankees are a good baseball team because they have won a lot of World Series championships. Go ahead and make some changes to the sentence. Make it more persuasive. Maintain the same general idea, right? You don't want to completely rewrite, the idea in the sentence, but there are a couple of things here that are not very good according to our diction and syntax rules that we talked about. Change them. Make them better. Pause this video and I'll pause it. Yeah, you guys know the deal by now. Okay. I seem to have deleted accidentally my answer for the first one, but that's okay. I think I can pretty much do this without having an answer key. The New York Yankees are a good baseball team because they have won a lot of World Series championships. So right away, I don't like good. I don't like a lot. Those are the things that immediately jump out to me, right? Good means nothing. We could say successful. Successful is much better here than good. I think I'm going to go ahead and do that, right? The New York Yankees are a successful baseball team. Or we could say the most successful baseball team, maybe. Because they have won a lot of World Series championships, we could say because they have won 27 World Series championships, we could say because they have won the most World Series championships, we could say because they have won more World Series championships than any other team. Any of those are better than saying a lot, right? A lot it doesn't tell us much of anything. Those are the two biggest things here. I think there could be some syntax changes as well. I think we could maybe rephrase this a little bit or reorder the ideas a little bit to make it better as well. But those are the two most important things. Good and a lot. Change that to something better. All right, let's look at 2. 2 says, scientists do not have any proof, so it makes sense that ghosts might not be real. Give this a pause, work on that, and then unpause when you're done. Okay, here is what I wrote for this one. So the syntax here, first of all, is weird, right? Scientists do not have any proof, so it makes sense that ghosts might not be real. Scientists do not have any proof is a weird way to start this sentence. So we can either start the sentence by saying ghosts might not be real because scientists don't have any proof, or we can add a because to the beginning here to try to fix it that way, but something needs to be done with the syntax here. There's a couple different ways you could fix it. Other things, might not be real is a big thing here that stands out. I rewrote this as, because science has yet to uncover any concrete evidence proving their existence, the only logical conclusion that can be drawn about ghosts is that they are not real. I think that fixes a lot of the syntactical issues. It gets rid of the might not, right? It changes might not to the only logical conclusion, which is a much stronger way to convey that idea. It gets rid of it makes sense, which is just kind of weird. And yeah, I think it does a little much for this assignment. Yours does not have to be this kind of completely rewritten, but do you see the differences here? Do you see how the second one is stronger than the first one? By changing the syntax, by changing might not to the only logical conclusion, but still maintaining that same idea, right? They're conveying the same idea. B is just way more, or my changes are just way more persuasive than the original. Let's do some practice now. We should have a pretty good idea by this point from this activity, or those activities that you did. Now, let's write our own evidence using persuasive diction and syntax, and commentary as well. Our claim, Shakespeare's work is not relevant to modern readers. Come up with 2 pieces of evidence and appropriate commentary for this claim, and make use of persuasive diction and syntax while doing so. Pause this, work on this, unpause when you are done. All right, here's mine. It is difficult for modern readers to understand the humor in Shakespeare's work, as humor changes across time periods and cultures. Jokes or references that 16th century audiences may have found hilarious are often lost on readers that are not familiar with the ideas, innuendos, or slang that the humor is derived from. If readers have to constantly check footnotes to know that something is supposed to be funny, perhaps the work is too outdated to be effective. So we have a claim about it not being relevant. Our first piece of evidence is that it's difficult for modern readers to understand the humor. And then I provide the commentary about how if people have to constantly check footnotes, it's too outdated to be effective. And also I provide commentary explaining that, well, I think this is still part of the evidence, this first part. But yeah, it connects this idea about it not being relevant at the end here about how it's too outdated to be effective because they don't understand the humor. And then let's look at the second part. Similarly, the themes and subject matter are not applicable to modern culture. That's the second piece of evidence. Take Macbeth, for example. This is like evidence on the evidence. Stories about overthrowing kings have no relevance to modern readers, as monarchy has largely been replaced by democracy in most developed countries. If readers cannot relate to the humor nor the themes, perhaps it's time to leave Shakespeare behind. So this is that commentary that connects our claim back to our thesis, which we don't even necessarily know about. But yeah, we also have no relevance to modern readers, as monarchy has largely been replaced by democracy. That's the commentary explaining how this evidence relates to this claim. And as far as the persuasive diction and syntax in here, it's not so much pointing out specific things that are persuasive, but it's about avoiding those things that aren't persuasive, right? There is nothing in here that is vague, nothing in here that is kind of unspecific, nothing in here that is indirect. Everything is direct, straightforward, specific. So it fits our requirements for having persuasive diction and syntax. Again, your claims or your evidence and commentary doesn't need to be exactly the same as mine, as long as you meet all the requirements that we've talked about up until this point. Let's talk about rhetorical appeals. This is kind of our second micro way of being persuasive. And these are hopefully things that you should be familiar with. I'm pretty sure these should be covered in the AP English curriculum. But just as a reminder, or just in case you were a teacher and never got to it, there are 3 classical rhetorical appeals that you can use to persuade your reader or your audience. You have ethos, which is persuasion by emphasizing the credibility of the person presenting the argument. So for example, if you have a study done by some famous scientist, right, you can use the credibility of that famous scientist to make your argument more persuasive, right? This famous person or this credible person agrees with me, so that makes my argument better. That's ethos. Logos is persuasion by logic, research, and data. Not specifically, the credibility of the person presenting the data, but just logic in general, right? A is true, and A is similar to what I'm saying, right? I'm saying B, and we know that A is true. So if A is true, B must also be true, right? That sort of idea. That's logos. And then we have pathos, which is persuasion by appealing to the audience's emotions. Surely you care about this thing, right? If you care about this thing, then you'll agree with my opinion. That sort of thing. You can use multiple of these in your writing, or you can use all of these. And I think I talk about... so I kind of go into the... okay. You can use all of these. You can use multiple of these. You can only use one of these. Which ones you choose to use is kind of dependent, or at least partly dependent, on what type of evidence you have available to you. So, for example, if you have a quote from a famous person in your evidence, or if you have data from a scientist, right? If it's a synthesis essay and you have, I know I talked about how these building an argument ideas are specific to the argument essay, but the synthesis essay is the same thing as the argument essay in some aspects, except that your evidence is coming from sources rather than from yourself. So it applies to that as well. If you have this, though, if you have a quote from a famous person, either in a provided source or one in your head, if you have data from a well-known scientist, use ethos, right? Rely on or lean on the reputation of the person whose quote you're using. If you have evidence that relates to something personal to your audience, right? If the audience has some sort of personal stake in the topic, if you're, talking about school safety, right? And you're talking to parents that have students in the school, rely on the fact that, or lean on the fact that they have children that are in the school, and that they care about their children, right? If your argument is logic-based, use logos. You are not limited to one of these. You don't have to use all of them. It's up to you to decide which ones you want to use, which ones you can use effectively. But if you can use multiple of them effectively, I would definitely recommend doing that. It can only make your argument stronger the more that you kind of use these. Let's practice. Okay. Sorry. So for each of these, we first want to identify which rhetorical appeals could be used. And then once we do that, we want to write one or two persuasive sentences using those appeals. Your sentences don't need to be like anything specific, right? You're given a claim, you're given evidence. Don't even think in terms of the essay when you're writing these. Just write one or two sentences that are like sort of related to what's going on, right? It doesn't need to be evidence or commentary or anything specific. Just use one of these, practice using one of these appeals or multiple of these appeals. So let's look at one. Our claim is that littering has a negative impact on the local area. Our evidence is that littering is harmful to wildlife and that littering makes the community visually unappealing. And we'll do this one together. Which rhetorical appeals could we use here? Well, for the first one, hang on. I'm just making sure. Let me double check. Okay, that's what I thought. We can definitely use logos here, right? And that would probably apply mostly to this first one. Littering is harmful to wildlife. Littering has a negative impact on the local area. You can logically kind of explain how littering being harmful to wildlife has a negative impact on the local area. All right, you could appeal to logic there. If there's less wildlife, then there will be more pests, right? Because maybe the wildlife is the predators that are eating the pests. Or if there's less wildlife, then the community doesn't look as nice. Well, I guess that's the second part, but you get the idea. Logos can connect the ideas there. You could also use pathos here. For the second one, right? About it making the community visually unappealing, that's something that people have a personal stake in. They want their community to look nice. They care about their community. So you can use pathos here to connect the idea about littering looking visually unappealing to their personal interests in keeping the community looking nice. You could also use pathos to this first part as well, about it being harmful to wildlife, right? Because people tend to like animals. So you could, paint a picture of the poor animals that are affected by this, right? And what's happening to those animals. You can appeal to people's emotions because people like animals. They care about animals. So pathos definitely could be used here. Logos could definitely be used here. I think the only one that could not be used is ethos, right? Because we don't have any credible person or institution that we're able to lean on or to rely on. So now that we've identified that, now I want you to pause, go ahead and come up with one or two persuasive sentences using those appeals, using each of those appeals, and then unpause when you are done. Okay, here's what I wrote. That's kind of hard to see. Let me move it at the bottom. Move it to the bottom. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so for logos, I wrote, every piece of trash that ends up in the outside world has the risk of being mistaken for food by animals. Littering must be prevented, that's supposed to say prevented, not preventing, in order to protect wildlife, right? It's just making those logical connections. Littering has a negative impact, it's harmful to wildlife. Every piece of trash has the risk of being eaten by animals. There's the logical connection there. For pathos, the example I wrote was, littering can have harmful effects on wildlife and can even lead to death if animals ingest debris. Every time someone throws a piece of trash on the ground or out of their car window, he or she is engaging in an action that can lead to the death of an innocent animal. Right? Both of these are focused on the same piece of evidence. Both of these kind of things that I wrote are focusing on the evidence about littering being harmful to wildlife. But I've framed the arguments in drastically different ways based on what appeal I was going for. And you have the flexibility to do multiple of these for the same piece of evidence or use different appeals for different pieces of evidence. It's up to you. It's whatever you think is most effective here. But this kind of really shows the flexibility you have in using these rhetorical appeals, right? The second one talks about death of animals, and then it frames it in a personal way, right? Every time someone throws a piece of trash on the ground, he or she is engaging in an action that can lead to the death of an innocent animal, right? You are kind of putting the person in that perspective, saying, if you litter, you could be killing animals, right? You're making it personal. You're really appealing to their emotions there. So yeah, that's kind of the difference in how these appeals can be used. Go ahead and take a look at the second one here. I'm going to probably delete this. If you need to see it, you can pause the video, but I'm going to delete this so I have room for the second one. Claim 2, or yeah, question number 2, practice number 2. Our claim is the same. Littering has a negative impact on the local area. Our evidence is data from Harvard University demonstrating that littering results in wildlife deaths and that littering makes the community visually unappealing. So go ahead, take a second, first identify which rhetorical appeals you could possibly use here. And then once you've identified the appeals that you could use, come up with a couple sentences for each of those appeals. And just kind of practice writing in those appeals. Pause the video, take as much time as you need, unpause when you're done. Okay, so I'm not going to go into another logos or pathos example because we did those previously. But I will go into an ethos example here because that's really what changed between 1 and 2, right? We can still use pathos, right? Because we're talking about littering makes the community visually unappealing. We could use pathos to talk, make that personal for people. We can use logos, right? To in both of these, logos can pretty much be used most of the time. There's always some sort of logical argument that could be made. But the difference between 2 and 3 is that we can also use ethos for 2 because we have data from Harvard University. And Harvard is a well-known institution, right? Everyone knows Harvard. It's well-respected. So having information from Harvard makes your argument stronger. So a way we could do that, littering can have detrimental effects on wildlife. As a study by Harvard University scientists demonstrate, there is a direct correlation between littering and wildlife deaths, right? Adding that Harvard University in there uses someone else's reputation to improve our own argument, to make our own argument stronger. So those are rhetorical appeals.